Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. We are going to explore precognition today. With me is Dr. Ed May. He is the former director of the U.S. Military Intelligence Program, normally called Stargate, or popularly known as Stargate. He is also the co-author of ESP Wars, East and West, and also co-author of Anomalous Cognition, Remote Viewing Research and Theory. He is also the co-editor of a 2-volume set of articles called Extrasensory Perception, Support, Skepticism, and Science. He is the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Parapsychology Association. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. And to talk about precognition, I think most people understand that precognition is somehow obtaining information from the future.
Yes.
And there are philosophers I've interviewed who say it's impossible because the future hasn't happened yet.
Well, that's a major challenge. First of all, let's define precognition. Tomorrow I'm going to flip a coin.
Yeah.
And it's going to land heads or tails, assuming it doesn't bounce on the corner. And I am flipping that coin after you guess whether it's going to be heads or tails. That is, by very nature of its time, an operational definition of what we mean by precognition.
Except I wouldn't be guessing.
No, well, yeah, using a remote viewing
Yeah.
to get whether it's heads or tail.
If it's a simple guess, then it's not precognition.
Well, except people guess over and over again, and they show a slight statistical favor that their guesses really were remote viewing.
Well, in that case, somebody might say the coin was biased.
Let's assume that the coin was not biased.
Okay.
You can put a lot of effort in determining whether the coin is biased, particularly if it's a random coin in a computer. You can make sure that it is, in fact, not biased. That's the operational definition of precognition. But what comes to mind is, what about the other psychic phenomena that we all know about, like telepathy and like clairvoyance? Telepathy means mind-to-mind communication, and clairvoyance means mind-to-object communication, if you will. And even some parts of psychokinesis sound like, well, maybe mind is forcing a piece of physical hardware to be different than it would otherwise be. But it doesn't happen all the time. There's some kind of statistical wiggle. Yeah. And that will lead into an interesting idea here in a moment.
Well, there's also retrocognition, where people are somehow apparently able to look into the past.
Right. That's for sure.
Yeah.
In fact, I think Stephen Schwartz has done some psychic archaeology.
Psychic archaeology.
It's great work.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so now how does all that work?
That's a mystery.
Well, maybe not.
That's what we're going to get to.
Okay.
I think we can spill the beans a little bit and say that you've recently published a paper in which you suggest that precognition is the paradigm through which we can look at all psychic functioning of information transmission.
Exactly. Let's try to figure out why we came to that conclusion. Look, if you're going to take a test in college, when it's all over with, you get a score, how well you did.
Yes.
In other words, an answer, how well you did when you took the test.
Right.
Any research at all, and any kind of activity, particularly in ESP and so on, there's an answer book out there. It's called the feedback. It's how you know you did well or not. And except that answer book hasn't been written yet while you're doing your remote viewing. You're going to flip a coin in the future. But if you could do precognition in any answer book, you should have access to that answer book.
Right.
So let's take a telepathy experiment. We're going to do one here right on camera. Oh, actually, I think we've done that one of our earlier sessions. Okay, let's take clairvoyance.
Okay.
There's a photograph of the hall down there, all right? And you give me a great description, right? And that looks like mind-to-object communication.
Yes.
And we go down there, get the photograph, and bring it back here. Look, Jeffrey, look how well you did. That's the answer book.
Yeah.
You could, in principle, use your precognition to look at your future experience of looking at the answer right here.
Well, that's the very reason why many decades ago, J.B. Rhine and other parapsychologists decided to use the word psi to refer to all of these information transmission modalities, because pretty much you can't distinguish one from another.
And that's why we wrote the paper that psi is all precognition.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that it is. Look at this. I'm lazy as a physicist.
Yeah.
If I don't have to invent something new, boy, I don't want to invent something new. So if I have telepathy, well, I've got to figure out some sort of model. What is the target in a telepathic situation? You know, let's assume I've got great neurological surgery capacities, and I ask you to think of a puppy, and then I dig your brain out of your head, and I use everything I can think of. There's no puppiness in your head.
Right.
There's nothing that I can tell externally that there's a puppy.
Yes.
So one problem with telepathy is, what's the target? Well, one target might be, I'm thinking of a number, and you guess it right, and I say, right on, Jeffrey, good show.
Yeah.
In your future is me saying to you, right on, that was the right number.
In other words, there's virtually no kind of ESP test for which we can rule out precognition.
Absolutely. And so, well, maybe telepathy is there, but since we can't rule out precognition, and we can guarantee that precognition has, in other experiments, works in the laboratory, it makes great sense. Let's only look at one strange mystery as opposed to a bunch of them.
And furthermore, well, what you're suggesting, because you're dealing with an information transmission model from a scientific perspective, you're saying we may have a better handle on explaining retrocausality, or information moving from the future into the present, or from the present into the past, then...
Not that one.
All right. Let's just say future into the present.
Right.
Then say information traveling from a distant location into my mind instantaneously.
Right. Now, the reason I balked at looking into the past, you know, all the physicists who are concerned today, mainstream physics people, not ESP people, are dealing with, like there just was a symposium in San Diego on this very topic, quantum retrocausation.
It's a hot topic in physics.
Absolutely. In other words, is it possible that some future event can influence the present, which is different than saying the present can influence the past? All of the physicists are in agreement, including me, the past is the past and you can't undo it. But the door is open that maybe some future event might in fact influence the present. Helmut Schmidt did an experiment many years ago, retro PK he called it, right?
Yes.
Okay, so just to remind you quickly what he did, he had a random number generator, and he would make read-only memory chips based on the output of the random number generator. And he would put half of them away in the safe, and a few weeks later he'd send the other half off to a whole bunch of people, and they would listen to clicks in each ear, and their job was to get more clicks in one ear than the other. And sure enough, that worked beautifully. And so he initially interpreted that their intent in the future influenced the present time when he was making the chips in the first place.
Yes.
Clever idea. And I frankly said, well, Helmut, what you're really doing is you've got a bunch of chips. Some are deviant and some are not. And you used your ESP in present time to sort them.
Yeah.
And that caught his attention. So maybe retrocausation actually occurs. I don't think it actually does occur.
Well, how can you have precognition without retrocausation?
No, it's the causation part. That causation means something in the future is forcing something to happen in the present. In other words, let's take the idea, and all this is what's called a signal-based model. Very complicated. Something tomorrow in downtown Las Vegas is going to be generated randomly.
Okay.
And that information propagates like photons from the sun. It propagates through space and time, coming backward in time. Not causally, it's a propagation of information. And it's sitting here right before you, and you read it.
Okay.
Just like you look at a pretty sunset on the beach. Or photons coming from the sun, same thing. Now, that sounds wonderful, but it's really difficult because we don't know what the psychic equivalent of a photon is. We're working on it. But there are some real clever ideas, and we can discuss that model in some detail.
So in other words, Helmut Schmidt's research that he called retro-PK is different than precognition.
Yes.
Because he's affecting the physical memory chips.
Yeah, he thought. I'm not sure he did, but that was the origin of his thinking.
That was the idea.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is retro-causation is not the same as retro-information transmission.
Well, this leads us directly into any kind of study of any kind. Let's take random number generator PK.
Yeah.
They call it micro-PK.
Yes.
Now, I don't know if you know the first paper that Helmut wrote in 1969, he called it Precognition of a Quantum Process. The next paper, he invented micro-PK for the same thing.
I see.
So the idea is your mind reaching in there and making this thing behave differently than it would otherwise on its own be? That's one way. Another possibility I'll illustrate in the following way. Suppose I have an absolutely guaranteed fair coin and fair coin flipper, okay? And I flip it 10,000 times, and you write down heads, tails, tails, heads, heads. Big, long strip of paper.
Yes.
And then I give you a pencil and paper and a pencil, and I say, walk along this long strip and use your not remote viewing ability, your sighted ability, looking at this set of things, draw a line such that the next 200 flips has too many heads in it.
Okay.
You could easily do that by the nature of randomness.
Yeah.
Okay, what if in this you had precognition ability in random number generator experiments that you could look into the future and start counting when a burst of ones were coming your way. And that turns out you can put arithmetic to it and test it exquisitely carefully. All of the random number generator PK stuff says it's informational rather than causal.
Okay, this is an important insight because now you are suggesting that the experiments that were called micro-PK could well be precognition.
Yes.
And in fact, I think the many macro-PK experiments might also, or I don't even want to call them experiments, but observations, like some of the observations I did with a fellow who called himself the PK man, could be explained as precognition, where he would say, I'm going to cause such and such an event, a storm to occur in the middle of a drought, and the storm occurs, and he says, I caused it, but he might have only precognized it.
In that case, true. But if I walk into your office and find you levitating the ceiling, I'm not going to say it's my lucky day, I caught you at it, and you do it frequently, that kind of deal. If you do something and, it's a gray area, but if you're at one end of that gray area, I'm not going to accuse it of my precognition just to catch you as something.
You're not ruling out the possibility of macro-PK.
Absolutely not. There are a lot of interesting things, poltergeist, which really catch your attention.
Yeah.
But let me give you another example. In fact, in the future, maybe this whole idea, we've put a model together called decision augmentation theory.
Yes.
We make decisions. How we make decisions is a very complex thing. You read the newspaper. Let's suppose you want to buy a house. And so it's a complex decision. You get your spouse and you argue about it. Well, it's got so many bedrooms and so on. Well, that process is not well understood. In decision augmentation, we said, whatever's going on in normal decision, we're going to sneak a little bit of ESP in there that will slightly augment your decision processes. So let's take a case in medical drug trials.
Okay.
Right. So we have a population, and we have a control group and an effort group, and you have a non-biased random process that sorts people into the control group and the effort group, and you give shots to each of those, and you reap the benefit. Whatever was in that shot versus placebo actually worked, and you call it healing. But, in any population, there's not uniformity in humans or rats or any other way. So imagine a rat population. We've got some really healthy rats that go to the gym, and we have some pretty weak, sick, couch potato rats that watch TV all day long. And suppose we could cheat. This will make it clear. Suppose you cheat. And you say, well, nobody's looking. I'll put the healthy rats in the effort group, and I'll put the really sicky rats, for the most part, in the control group. It'll look like whatever was in the syringe healed them.
Right.
But you could put water in those syringes, and it would still look like it healed.
That's right.
Okay, I'm not choosing medical trials. I'm not accusing them of cheating. However, if they use a random process, suppose it is biased by decision augmentation to slightly sort these otherwise, slightly sort these populations into the appropriate group to mimic psychic healing, or not psychic healing, but medical healing.
Conventional healing. But so what you're saying here is that if precognition exists, and we believe that there's good data, empirical data confirmed by numerous laboratories,
and even some in ours,
around the world over many, many decades.
Yes,
I would guess at this point maybe 100 good published studies. That it's possible that this effect is contaminating the findings in conventional biological medical research.
Or any research that used statistical inference to come to the outcome. Now, that sounds scary. If it does bias, it's really small. I mean, you put penicillin in a petri dish full of bacteria, it kills them. That's not an issue here. But a lot of times there are some weak effects. I mean, the effects of some drugs are very tiny. And at least the door is open slightly. It doesn't mean it actually happens, but you have to at least pay attention
Well,
to
our
it.
friend, the statistician Jessica Utz, has pointed out that the evidence statistically for the well-known medical biological phenomenon that aspirin helps prevent heart attacks is statistically weaker than the evidence for extrasensory perception.
Absolutely true. And the other part of that, the best paper I know for the evidence of precognition is Chuck Honerton and Ferrari's analysis of all the precognition card guessing thing, where the effect size, how big the effect was, is the same as the aspirin thing. And people believe the aspirin thing and reject the ESP thing, although they're the same magnitude of the effect.
So we're talking about an effect that could have real-world consequences.
But the key point here for this discussion, it's based on precognition.
Yes.
And so when we looked at precognition as being such a robust phenomenon, and you can interpret it in all statistical circumstances for clairvoyance, telepathy, even healing, all the data that we have in parapsychology, it's almost all statistically based. Not macro-PK. If you wind up a spoon, I'm sorry, that's not a statistic. Or you float to the ceiling, that's not, well, maybe you do it too often, that gets rather once in a while.
So, if we're to assume that your hypothesis is correct...
It is, of course. We never make mistakes.
It's certainly a reasonable hypothesis.
Of course
and
it is.
If it is correct, it means that we only need to look at one mechanism.
Yes, isn't that wonderful if it's true?
That we don't have to think about separate mechanisms for clairvoyance, telepathy, retrocognition, precognition. It could conceivably be all a matter of precognition.
Yes, and I hope that's true. You know, it's certainly a hypothesis that deserves far more testing that has been applied so far. And if it's true, it's exceptionally valuable for the reason you just pointed out.
Now, there are other viewpoints that just...
And they're all wrong, of course.
So, some people might say, no, it's psychokinesis. That's the model for all.
Okay, well, I'm willing to listen. There's a well-known neuroscientist named David Eagleman. He invented a marvelous term for this. He calls himself a possibillion, which everything's possible, but not everything's probable. So I'm open to that, but you have to show me the data. I'm a data-driven guy, and so far, the precognition model, which we can compare to data, fits the model better than a PK model would.
But how do you deal with the paradoxes that precognition implies?
Tell me one.
Well, if precognition is true, then it would seem to me that I might not have any free will.
Beautiful. Somebody paid me to look at free will versus determinism. What a great thing. One of the issues there, I'll tell you two quick stories if we have the time. One is we were doing an experiment, an experiment basically, using associational remote viewing on a 6-horse race. And we had a great remote viewer, and we said, okay, please describe now the place we're going to take you to tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon. And we got a great match. We went and bet on it was a 1/4 horse race. The whole thing was over in 10 seconds, and we won. We had $300 in our pocket. The next day we went back to this guy and said, okay, we're ready to go take you to the site. And he said, unfortunately, I'm not going with you. Come on, I'm watching TV. So at 2 in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So that gets really interesting. Would the money vanish out of our pocket? Because he did not describe where he was going to be at 2 o'clock the next morning.
Okay.
So how did, wow, that is a free will versus determinism thing.
Yeah.
What that told us about is precognition allows you to have access to probable futures, not ones that actually occur. The most probable future we would have taken to the Golden Gate Bridge or whatever the target was. The actualized future was him sitting on the couch watching football.
Okay, but if you're looking at probable futures, those probable futures exist in the present. You don't need to have retrocausal information transfer.
But they also sit in the future. Yeah. There's a couple of futures hanging out there while he's doing his remote viewing. One is the most likely one. We're going to take him to some site. In other words, that answer book he has access to. Yeah. But there's a second answer book hanging out there where he sits in front of his TV.
And watches the race.
Yeah. Well, not watches the race. He's watching football.
Watching football.
Yeah.
So he's not getting any feedback.
Well, of course we give him. Well, we tell him he won money. That's the feedback he gets. Give me my share of money. Get lost. I'm busy.
Okay. So the experimental protocol is violated at that point.
Yeah. Well, that's right. But it didn't stop the success of the program.
Okay.
Now, we've done experiments, the world's most boring experiment, where you press a number between 1 and 6 and ask which face of a die is going to appear on your, eventually on your screen. And the roll of the die in the computer is perfectly guaranteed to be random, in other words, equally for each of the 6. Half the time we pull a nasty trick on you. If you press number 2, it rolls the die, and then it rolls it again. Whatever the face of the die that comes up on the first roll, which you don't see, is, let's say, 4.
Okay.
Then we roll the die quickly again, and we bias that rolling so that 4 has a 50% chance of coming up, and all the other faces have 10%. So we've modified the future from a biased future to one that's flat.
You're modifying the probabilities.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so people did this. It's a very boring experiment.
Right.
At the end of the day, you can ask the question experimentally, empirically. If did the person guess on the average the probable future or only the future that actually appeared in his face, even though there was some probable future elsewhere? What came out, it was very clear. The people had access to probable futures, whether it was the one displayed on the tube or not.
I see.
I mean, someone paid me to do that answer, and that's a great result. It says we have free will.
Well, now that I think about it, my late friend and your late friend too, Alan Vaughan, a specialist in precognition, the author of Patterns of Prophecy.
I know it well.
That was his hypothesis about precognition.
I had forgotten that. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So the good news is if you have a psychic, have a precognitive dream that you're going to get hit in the car going to work tomorrow, stay home. You're fine.
So what you've demonstrated, or at least you have very suggestive evidence here that would be of interest to philosophers, I should think, especially, is that precognition is not necessarily incompatible with free will.
And not only that, in our book, Extrasensory Perception, Support, Skepticism, and Science, we had a mainstream philosopher from Australia address the question of whether it violates causality. What do you mean by causality? My glass will not drop unless and until I open my hands, and then it will fall. It won't ever fall until I open my hands.
Right.
That's kind of causality, if you will. All right. And he was able to show in a very compelling way that precognition does not violate causality. It's an excellent piece because if you have a transmission model that the information is propagating through time, you are not looking in the future where it looks like it's causality. That's stuff sitting right here in front of your face and you're just reading it, as it were. And he uses that in a very clever, very powerful argument in favor that precognition does not violate causality. Brilliant piece on his part.
So what you're saying is that we have the possibility of conducting studies, empirical research, which is going to give us insight into the nature of time itself.
Yes, and free will.
And free will.
Other than that, why bother?
And causality.
Yes. That's what's so thrilling about this stuff. It really is great.
We're dealing with some of the most fundamental questions that people can ask, and we're beginning to have an empirical purchase on those.
Yeah. In fact, Chuck Arnerton was the first person I've heard discuss it from that point of view. We are developing a toolkit to investigate some of the pressing, most mysterious questions humans have been asking about reality from the get-go.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you have developed a model
Yes.
of precognition. We're running out of time now, but we will do another interview exploring in detail how precognition might actually operate.
Yes.
That'll be exciting. Because there's still the big question that many people would have, which is, well, precognition can't work because the future hasn't happened.
Okay, we'll talk about that.
Well, I suppose as a sneak preview, we could say that in physics, certainly in quantum physics, time doesn't work the same way it works in the macro world.
Well, that's also true, but we don't have to resort to quantum theory to understand it.
Okay.
We can talk about that. I mean, the real sort of spoiler alert. That if you use what's called a signal model instead of some sort of global way of getting it, there's a signal coming from the future and you have access to it now. It's a local phenomenon right in front of your nose.
Well, Ed May, once again, this has been extremely stimulating. Now, I might confess I'm getting a little bit of a headache. Sometimes my mind just spins dealing with these concepts, and I wouldn't be surprised if some viewers are feeling the same, but nonetheless spinning in a positive way.
Well, Dean Radin has a wonderful phrase about this. That makes my brain hurt.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm beginning to feel a little of that, and I'm glad for it.
Well, good.
Thank you so much, Ed.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.